The Dowding system was the world's first wide-area ground-controlled interception network, controlling the airspace across the United Kingdom from northern Scotland to the southern coast of England. It used a widespread dedicated landline telephone network to rapidly collect information from chain home radar stations and the Royal Observer Corps in order to build a single image of the entire UK airspace and then direct defensive interceptor aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery against enemy targets. The system was built by the Royal Air Force just before the start of World War II and proved decisive in the Battle of Britain. The Dowding system was developed after tests demonstrated problems relaying information to the fighters before it was out of date. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, solved the problem through the use of hierarchical reporting chains. Information was sent to Fighter Command Headquarters' central filter room at Bentley Priory and used to prepare a map of the battle. Details of the map were then relayed to the group and sector headquarters, where operators recreated the map at of scale covering their area of operations. Looking at the maps, commanders could make decisions on how to employ the forces quickly and without clutter. Instructions were relayed to the pilots only from the squadron's sector control rooms, normally co-located at the fighters' operating bases. The Dowding system is considered key to the success of the RAF against the German Air Force during the Battle of Britain. The combination of early detection and rapid dissemination of that information acted as a force multiplier, allowing the fighter force to be used at extremely high rates of effectiveness. In the pre-war period, interception rates of 30% to 50% were considered excellent. That meant that over half the sorties sent out would return without having encountered the enemy. During the battle, average rates were well over 80%, and several raids were met with 100% success rates. Lacking their own direction system, Luftwaffe fighters had little information on the location of the RAF counterparts, and often returned to base having never seen them. When they did, the RAF fighters were almost always in an advantageous position. Although many histories of the Battle of Britain comment on the role of radar, it was only in conjunction with the Dowding system that radar could be truly effective. This was not lost on Winston Churchill, who noted that development previous systems to counter air raids on London during World War I. E.B. Ashmore constructed a system known as the London Air Defence Area. Ashmore put defensive weapons into 3 rings around the city, searchlights and anti-aircraft artillery in the outer ring, fighter aircraft in the middle ring, and the innermost ring in the city contained more anti-aircraft guns. Ashmore set up a large plotting table in the Horse Guards in London. Information from spotters was relayed to this central room where wooden blocks were placed on a large map to indicate the location of aircraft and other information. Observers around the map could relay this information to one of 25 regional control rooms, who recreated the portions of the map relevant to them and passed the information to the various weapons in the region. After the war, LADA was run by a War Office department known as Air Defence of Great Britain. ADGB was responsible for the defence of the entire British Isles during the 1920s and 30s. LADA became the metropolitan area, and ADGB expanded on Ashmore's system to deal with longer-ranged and faster-moving aircraft. Coloured markers matched coloured areas on a sector clock, marking off 5-minute intervals. As plots were called in, the plotters used markers with the colour pointed to by the clock, which produced multicoloured paths of markers on the table, making easily followed tracks. The freshness of the information could be determined the colour of the latest marker. An identical system was later set up in the Midlands. The system lacked early detection, which was deemed essential as the performance of aircraft improved. Experiments with acoustic mirrors and similar devices were carried out, but these always proved unsatisfactory, with detection rates often as low as 5 miles even in good conditions. Lacking an alternative, in December 1934, the Air Ministry made plans to deploy sound detection devices around London as part of the Thames Estuary Plan, RDF. A month after the Thames Estuary Plan was approved, the TIZAD committee was formed to consider newspaper reports about a German radio-powered death ray. The committee consulted a radio expert, Robert Watt, for a judgment on the report. Watt tasked his assistant, Arnold Wilkins, to carry out the necessary calculations. Wilkins quickly concluded that it was impossible. The amount of radio energy needed would be well beyond the state-of-the-art of existing electronics. When Watt asked about alternatives, Wilkins recalled a General Post Office report on aircraft causing fading in radio reception, and suggested that this effect might be used to detect aircraft at long range. The two wrote a joint memo on the concept and returned it to the TIZAD committee in time for the first formal meeting in late January 1935. The committee seized upon the concept as a potential solution to the problem of bomber detection and the fear that the bomber will always get through. A second memo with more detailed calculations arrived in February and was shown to the Air Member for Supply and Research, Hugh Dowding. He was impressed with the concept, but wanted a practical demonstration. This was carried out on the 26th of February 1935, now known as the Daventry experiment, which clearly indicated the presence of a nearby aircraft. Dowding immediately released funding for development. By the summer of 1935, the system, code-named RDF, was able to detect bomber-sized targets at ranges of 60 miles. Plans were made to build a chain of RDF stations at about 25 miles intervals along the English coast in a system called Chain Home. On the 27th of July, Henry TIZAD suggested running a series of experiments of fighter interception, based on an estimated 15-minute warning time that RDF would provide. A 7-month-long series of tests began in the summer of 1936 at Biggin Hill, under the direction of Wing Commander Eustace Grenfell, aided by a navigation expert, Squadron Leader Robert Linton Wragg. Gloucester Gauntlet fighters intercepted virtual aircraft, civilian airliners, and then Bristol Blenheim light bombers. The first interceptions were calculated using trigonometry and mechanical calculators, but eventually Grenfell had enough of the confounded machines and directed a perfect interception by eye. TIZAD introduced the equal angles method of rapidly estimating an interception point by imagining the fighters and bombers at the opposite corners on the base of a triangle. The bombers were flying at a particular angle to the base, and the controller sent the fighters along the opposite angle to converge with the target at the apex of the triangle. With this dizzy angle, interception rates shot up, and by the end of 1936, they were consistently above 90% when the altitude was known and did not change. If the bombers changed their altitude, or the fighters arrived below them, maneuvering for the attack reduced the success rate to about 60%. Teething trouble ADGB was disbanded in 1936. Its duties were handed to the Air Ministry, and divided into Fight Command and Bomber Command. Dowding was promoted to Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Fight Command on its creation on 6 July 1936. The first operational CH station was set up at the Radar Researchers' new laboratory at Bawdsey Manor. In spite of rapid progress, RDF still had teething problems. On one occasion, Dowding was watching the displays of the test system for a sign of the attackers when he heard them overhead. These problems were remedied over the next year, and in April 1937, tests using the prototype CH radar at Bordesy demonstrated great promise, allowing the controllers to measure the altitude of the aircraft to within 2,000 feet, which greatly reduced the altitude problem. To increase warning time, the CH systems were built close to the shore facing out to sea, placing them as close to the enemy as possible. This meant they provided no information for friendly fighters on the way to the attack, or of enemy aircraft once they crossed the coast. For these areas, Dowding planned to rely on the existing observer course system that Fight Command inherited from ADGB. Using different equipment, the reports from CH and the ROC were sometimes contradictory, and the volume of information supplied by the national network was overwhelming. An added problem was the lack of identification of the aircraft. CH could not discriminate between friendly and hostile aircraft at the time, and the OC could not discriminate between friendly and enemy fighters when they were flying at high altitude. To address the problem of identification, Dowding pressed for a supply of high-frequency direction-finding sets, which could locate the fighters using their existing radio sets. This led to the introduction of the pipsqueak system that was widely available from early 1940, along with the first identification friend-IFO transponders, which were widespread by October 1940. This solved the identification problem, but meant that there were now three sources of information: RDF, OC and HUF-DUF, none of which had a complete picture of the airspace. Building the system, Dowding recognized that the main problem was not technical but too many sources of information, none of them with complete coverage and none able quickly to report useful information to the fighters. Dowding, Tizard and a mathematician, Patrick Blackett, another founding member of the committee, began to evolving a new system from that inherited from ADGB, to handle the mass of data and the potential for overlap. Dowding instituted a policy of sending all location reports from the radars to a new fighter direction center at Fight Command headquarters. This mimicked the system the OC had already set up for coordinating the reports from many individual spotters into a map covering a larger area. The new system did the same at a far larger scale, all of the UK, adding in reports from the top level of the OC. Telephone operators in contact with the RDF and OC centers relayed reports to workers around the map, who used these reports to place small colored markers on the map with the color indicating the time that the report was received. The markers formed lines which, as they elongated, indicated the location and direction of the targets. Each cluster was assigned a number, its track. As the paths of the targets became clear over time, operators observing the map picked tracks heading towards the various fighter groups and forwarded the information to the group headquarters. The group HQs used these reports to recreate a portion of the master map containing just the tracks relevant to them. Commanders at the group headquarters could easily picture the battle and assign fighters to targets. Targets assigned to squadrons within a sector were forwarded in this same fashion to the sector headquarters, which recreated the map at an even smaller scale, using this map to guide the fighters. By early 1939, the basic system had been built out, and from the 11th of August 1939, Bomber Command was asked to launch a series of mock attacks using aircraft returning from exercises over France. Reports from No. 11 Group RAF were enthusiastic, stating that RDF information and plotting throughout the exercise was consistently first-rate, and enabled interceptions to be effected on the coast, to which Dowding added, daylight raids were normally tracked and intercepted with ease and regularity. Description: filtering. The first improvement Dowding suggested was to add a filter room at FCHQ, where all CH reports were sent. stations converted their angle and range measurements into a location on the Ordnance Survey national grid. A telephone operator, or teller, forwarded this location to the filter room, where a plotter would place a small colored marker at that location on a large map covering most of the UK, the colors being the same as those adopted by the Observer Corps. The rapidity of reporting caused plot markers to pile up on the map, which became quite cluttered during larger missions. Since each station had inaccuracies, the plots spread out on the map. Observers watching the progress of plots tried to determine which of these represented one group of aircraft. When they were confident that a group of markers was a formation, a wooden block was placed on the map in the middle of the plots and numbers and letters placed on the block to indicate the aircraft type, number and altitude, and each block was given a track number. The block would be periodically moved or revised as further plot markers were placed on the board, and as it moved, plotters left small arrow-shaped pointers to illustrate where it had been. Once created, the entire network used the same track numbers from the radar operators, who could be asked to revise information for a given track, to the pilots intercepting them. Around and above the map were more tellers who controlled the communications, connecting incoming reports to the plotter on the floor nearest that location on the map, or connecting incoming requests for information to another teller who could read the map. Tellers examined the truck markers, whose larger print allowed them to see the information, although this sometimes required opera glasses. Sometimes information would have to be plotted that came from an external source, not normally part of the reporting chain. A fighter calling an SOS would report this through his radio on an emergency frequency, which would be picked up by the closest listening post. This information would also flow into the filter room, but they were not connected to the plotters on the floor. Operators above the map could mark locations of interest. Using theatrical spotlights and filters allowed them to change the message being projected. Reporting hierarchy. The second improvement introduced by Dowding was aimed at reducing the amount of information being sent to the pilots, and speeding its delivery. For this task, Dowding introduced a hierarchy of control and information flow, which ensured that only the information the pilots needed was forwarded to them. At the topmost level was FCHQ filter room, located at Bentley Priory. FCHQ maintained an overall view of the entire battle space. This information was then forwarded one step down a hierarchy, to the groups. During the Battle of Britain, the defensive fighters were split among 4 active groups, 10 through 13. 11 Group, which handled most of the fighting, had its plotting room located in the Battle of Britain bunker at Uxbridge, not far from FCHQ. 12 Group, covering the Midlands, was located at Hucknall. 13 Group in a quarry in Blakelaw outside Newcastle, and the late-formed 10 Group in the aptly named box outside Bath. At the Group HQ's another plotting board, covering only the area of interest to that group, recreated the plots from FCHQ via position reports sent to them over the telephone. This allowed the groups to recreate the map, but on a scale and location more suitable to their area of operations. Since the information was being pre-filtered, these maps did not have to be changed as often, and a somewhat simpler marker solution was adopted. Small wooden blocks with tags were placed on the map to represent the location of various formations, indicated by the ID number created in the filter room. The tags indicated the ID number, friend of foe status if known, the estimated number of aircraft, and their altitude. The color of the altitude tags indicated when the report was updated, matching the same sector clock pattern used at FCHQ. This allowed observers to quickly determine whether or not a plot was up to date, and request updates if needed. If a target was assigned squadrons for interception, these were indicated with cocktail stick-like tags with the squadron number on them. Each group was split into several sectors, which handled operations for one or more airfields. This formed the lowest level of the hierarchy, based at the sector controls, normally co-located at one of the sector's airfields. For instance, 11 Group was split into sectors A through F, running anti-clockwise from the southwest to northeast, along with sector Z to the northwest. A typical sector, Sector C, which saw considerable action, was controlled out of Biggin Hill, but also contained another major airbase at West Malling. Telephone links from sector to group allowed the group's version of the map to be recreated at the sector, again filtering out information that was not of interest in that area. It was the sector controls that were responsible for communication with the pilots, as well as barrage balloon and anti-aircraft batteries, providing early warning of the approach of the enemy or warning them not to fire on friendlies. To combat the problem that the fighter pilots tended to ignore orders from paper pushers, sector commanders were normally former pilots themselves, either retired or on medical leave. Dowding, Blackett and Tizard personally drove home the fact that the pilots could not simply hunt for their targets, and had to follow the instructions of the operations centers. By creating this system, information flow was primarily in one direction, and continued to be split out on the way down. For instance, the filter room might be receiving 15 reports per minute from various CH sites, but these would be about formations that might cover the entire coast of Great Britain. Portions of these reports, say those over Kent, would be sent to 11 Group, while others, the attack on Rafteryfield for instance, would only be relayed to 13 Group. In turn, 11 Group's operations room would relay only those tracks of interest down to the sectors, filtering out tracks that were out of the range, or being handled by other sectors. Finally, the sector operators only had to relay information to the pilots that actually had an effect on the flight. Data about other formations was not relayed, freeing the radio time. Information sources chain home offered an enormous improvement in early detection times compared to older systems of visual or acoustic location. It was not uncommon for CH stations on the southeast coast of Kent to detect enemy raids as they were still forming up over their airfields in France. Additionally, this information was available day and night, in any weather. However, to provide maximum warning time, the CH stations had to be placed as close to the shore as possible, as they could only locate objects in front of them. This meant that CH provided no service overland. This required 2 additional locating services. The task of tracking enemy aircraft over land fell to the Royal Observer Corps. Because of the large number of rock stations and the relatively small areas they covered, information duplication and overload was a concern. For this reason, information from the rock was sent to a parallel system of observer centers, who acted as both filter and communications stations. This pre-filtered information was then sent into the Dowding reporting chain. Likewise, a separate reporting chain was tasked with tracking friendly aircraft through the use of radio direction finding on the radio transmissions, using a system known as Huff Duff and Pipsqueak. Developing a fix using RDF requires 2 or more observation locations spread apart by some distance and then using triangulation on the reports. In this case, 3 stations were typically used, located about 30 miles apart. This information was reported to a selected sector control, who used this to plot the locations and pass on that information to the main operations plot. Controllers could then give directions to the squadrons. Locations of the fighters were sent up the chain only as required. Finally, information on the status of the fighter squadrons was known to the sectors but needed by the groups to choose which squadrons to commit. For this task, operations rooms also contained a series of blackboards and electrical lamp systems indicating the force strengths of the fighter squadrons and their current status, known as the tote board. This allowed commanders to tell at a glance which units were available to receive commands. The statuses were released, available, readiness, standby, airborne and moving into position, enemy sighted, or ordered to land, landed and refueling, rearming. Next to the tote board was a weather board. It was the responsibility of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters to continually update the tote and weather boards, and relay that information up the chain. Command. The most visible part of the Dowding system were the operations rooms. The most advanced of these were located at FCHQ and Group HQs. These rooms typically consisted of 3 layers: a large plotting table on the lowest level, communications operators located at desks around and above the plot, and a second story above the plot, sometimes behind glass, where commanders could observe and communicate. Command of the battle was devolved to the group. Observing the map from above, group commanders could track the movements of enemy aircraft through the patch, examine the tote board, select a squadron and called the sector to have them scramble. The orders could be as simple as Squadron 9-2, intercept hostile 2-1. The sector would then phone the office for that squadron and order the aeroplanes to be scrambled. After forming up, the sector control asked the squadron to set up the pipsqueak system so they could be tracked. Once the location was measured and transferred to the sector plotting table, the controller would relay instructions to the formation leader. Vectoring was accomplished using the methods developed in the Biggin Hill exercises in 1935, with the sector commander comparing the location of the friendly aircraft with the hostile plots being transferred from group and arranging the interception. As the fighters were faster and often reached the interception point first, they orbited the location, giving them time to climb and seek an advantageous position. Squadrons, bases and enemy formations were assigned code words to ease communication speed and accuracy. Amendments from sector control at Biggin Hill to 72 Squadron would take the general form: tennis leader, this is top hat control. Your customers are now over Maidstone, Vector 090, Angels 20. The Biggin Hill controller was asking 72 Squadron to fly due east at 20,000 feet to intercept the target. The sector was also responsible for local gun and balloon defenses and getting the fighters safely back to an airfield after the sortie. Physical construction FCHQ and group control centers, in keeping with their importance in the battle, were located in bomb-proof bunkers away from airfields. Most of these were built just before the war. Communications were ensured by hundreds of miles of dedicated phone lines laid by the GPO and buried deep underground to prevent them from being cut by bombs. Sector control centers tended to be relatively small, and were mostly housed in brick, single-story, tile-roofed structures above ground, where they were vulnerable to attack. By 1940, most were semi-protected by an earth bank or blast wall surrounding them which reached as high as the eaves. Fortunately, Luftwaffe intelligence was unaware of the importance of these rooms and most were left alone. The control rooms at Biggin Hill were destroyed by a raid on the 31st of August, but this was due to a chance bomb hit. As a further precaution, emergency control rooms were set up in different locations away from the airfields, with small loss in efficiency. Kenley, for example, could use an alternative room housed in a butcher's shop in nearby Caterham. The vulnerability of the earlier rooms was appreciated, and new airfields built during the expansion program of the 1930s used bomb-proof Mk2 L-shaped structures.